This video is sponsored by the Seeds of Decay Kickstarter. Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the only show on the internet that explores the lore and ecology of your favorite old school D&D monsters and then converts them into shiny new creatures for 5th edition. I know I've said this before, but today's Monster of the Week is the most obscure creature I have ever covered on this channel. And we've covered some pretty wild shit. When I say the word mummy, what comes to mind? The pharaohs of old. A film franchise starring beloved actor Brendan Fraser. A horrifying undead creature. This Halloween costume. Whatever you imagine, I guarantee it's not this. But Dungeon Dad, that just looks like a normal mummy, like one what's in the monster manual. And you're right, it does look like that. But this creature has a very interesting twist. The Fermented Mummy, affectionately referred to as the Booze Mummy, is basically your standard mummy type creature, except it's been mummified in enough liquor to knock an entire frat house on their collective asses. This ultimately results in one of the most interesting undead variants I've seen in a very long time. It has a variety of unique properties, not the least of which is a variation on mummy rot that instead of rotting away the target's flesh, causes their blood to turn into alcohol. This creature literally gets you drunk. And while we are going to dive into all these juicy details, first, like a fine wine, I want to savor the little details of this monster. Specifically, I want to talk about just exactly where it came from. The Fermented Mummy was originally published as the big bad monster for the final encounter of this adventure module released in 1995. And believe it or not, the weirdest part of Cleric's Challenge 2 was not the booze-infused mummy boss. The module itself was designed to be a single-player adventure. It was meant to be run by a dungeon master for a singular player character, specifically a cleric of 4th to 6th level. I imagine that's why it's called the Cleric's Challenge. This is so fascinating to me because we don't really see single-player-driven content for Dungeons & Dragons these days. Especially not anything official published by Wizards of the Coast, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. This adventure was actually the final entry in a series of products which all came out within a few years of one another called the Head-to-Head Quests. There were 2 of them released for each of the 4 Advanced Dungeons & Dragons classes. Those classes being Fighter, Thief, Cleric, and Wizard, of course. And as the name would suggest, Cleric's Challenge 2 was the second in the series of Cleric adventures. The history of these head-to-head quests is actually really interesting, but that's all kind of secondary to today's monster. I just thought it was a kind of cool piece of D&D history and was definitely worth bringing up. If you guys do want to know more about these modules, definitely let me know in the comments, because I would love nothing more than to do a deep dive on these old school modules and really see what they're all about. It might even be fun to run a few of these solo adventures and see how they stack up with today's expectations. But back to the mummy. In the module Where It's Found, the Fermented Mummy appears as Father Bernadette's mummy. It is named, of course, for the NPC whose untimely demise leads to the creation of the mummy. Obviously, we don't want a monster with an NPC's name attached to it for just general use, so I simplified the name down to the Fermented Mummy. I think this monster has so much potential for fun encounters and storytelling at the D&D table, but before we get into its lore and practical applications, we need to understand just exactly what it's capable of and what its abilities are. So I hope you can hold your liquor because it is time for... Clocking in at a challenge rating of 4, this mummy has a few really interesting tricks up its mummified sleeves. The first difference you're likely to notice between the Fermented Mummy and your garden variety mummy is that it has a shockingly high intelligence score for an undead creature. That's because our fermented pal here manages to maintain a lot of their personality in undeath. They even manage to cling to some of their most powerful memories. Here's your ticket, sir. Enjoy the movie. Thanks, you too. Now, their personalities, while somewhat intact, are often twisted by the evil magic required to raise a mummy from beyond the grave. They are still far from stupid. In the module this creature comes from, it uses advanced tactics regularly to subvert anyone trying to hunt it down. So while we may be dealing with a mummy, they are certainly no dummy. Oh my god, I should be so fired. Something it does share with your typical mummy is a fuck ton of damage resistances and immunities. But this of course comes at the cost of the mummy's infamous vulnerability to fire damage. These mummies are just the same because nothing's gonna burn quite like a dude soaked in alcohol. Another thing they have in common is the dreadful glare action, because nothing says mummy like the ability to scare the living daylights out of somebody by staring at them for a moment. But when we move along to the mummy's primary attack, that's where things start to get really interesting. The rotting fist of the mummy has been replaced by an intoxicating fist attack. This attack deals a bunch of bludgeoning and necrotic damage, but it also forces the target to make a constitution save against being poisoned. If the target fails, their blood begins turning into alcohol. While getting drunk for free while you're out partying with your friends might be awesome, it probably sucks a lot when you're fighting for your life against an undead horror beyond mortal comprehension. So if you do fail that saving throw, you will of course suffer the effects of being poisoned, which means you have disadvantage on most everything, but you also have your speed cut in half as you gradually become more and more drunk. And the good times will come to an end pretty quickly as well, because if you don't cure the poison within 12 hours, you straight up die. An undead creature that kills people with alcohol poisoning wasn't something I ever imagined I'd cover on the channel, but here we are. The final thing worth mentioning here is that the Fermented Mummy has the ability to raise undead once per day as a bonus action. This will allow the Fermented Mummy to slowly build up a squad of zombies and skeletons by raising the corpses of its victims. Because I mean, every good mummy needs victims to aid in its wine-tasting related shenanigans. In terms of building an encounter, I would use this monster in much the same way you might use a mummy lord, but for a much lower level party. It's going to do undead mummy things, and it's going to command lesser undead minions, and it's going to have slightly lesser schemes. Due to the heinous method of their creation, those schemes are usually going to involve revenge. But I am getting a little bit ahead of myself here, so let's take a step back, have a breather, and move on to talk about a few. So, making a fermented mummy is basically the worst. In order to successfully manifest this undead creature, you first must seal a living humanoid being inside of a large cask or barrel or vat or some type of container that is also filled with alcohol. Might be beer, might be wine, might be whiskey, it doesn't really matter, as long as there is a significant amount of alcohol to preserve the body and channel that mummy-making magic. The victim is doomed, of course, to drown within the alcoholic tomb they've been sealed in, and once they are no longer alive, an uttered curse to the proper malignant deity will bring about the rise of a fermented mummy in about a month. Hey, nobody said necromancers didn't have to be patient. So how do we use this in a D&D game? Well, to start our encounter making process, let's look at the module that the creature actually comes from. In the Cleric's Challenge 2 adventure, the mummy is actually created by accident. They started out as a priest, the aforementioned Father Bernadette, who was mistakenly sealed inside of a vat of wine during what I presume was the worst winery tour of all time. Also, coincidentally, the owner of said winery uttered a curse upon the rival winery next door after the priest had been sealed within. Just as an aside, this whole adventure is basically Hatfields and McCoys, but with wine, and I highly recommend you check it out. Anyways, this leads to the former priest rising as a murderous mummy, set on drowning all the townsfolk in a sort of poetic vengeance for the fact that he was drowned in a big vat of wine. An accidental booze mummy could work out to be really interesting, but that got me thinking, what if this creature was created on purpose? Who would do such a thing? Well, for starters, vampires are known to be undead and sip on wine, so a fermented mummy could be a pretty fun minion to throw at a party when vampires are involved. If you happen to be running Curse of Strahd, this one is for free. I could see the old bastard himself reveling in using the local winery as a summoning ground for the undead. What's also really fun about this creature is it is so accessible from an in-game perspective when compared to other sentient undead creatures. I imagine most necromancers start by raising skeletons and raising zombies, but the fermented mummy is a great stepping stone into that next tier. of undead minions. Normal mummies need to be embalmed, a difficult process that can involve lots of potentially expensive reagents not always readily available to every aspiring necromancer. To make a fermented mummy, all you need is a shit ton of alcohol and the proper incantation. That makes these creatures really potentially common if knowledge of their methodology were to spread throughout the world. They're also great because you can play the fermented mummy up for laughs in a silly kind of dark humor sort of way, or you could treat them as a really serious threat made by an up-and-coming necromancer who just doesn't have the same means as your typical archlich. Regardless of how you use them though, I definitely want to hear about all your ideas for plot hooks and encounters that we could throw at our players, so get in the comments and let me know. Hit me with your best booze mummy plot hooks. I also would not be talking about this creature today if it weren't for the incredible recommendation from Caden V over in the Dungeon Dad Discord. So thank you so much for this recommendation, and thank you for watching. As always, if you do want to use this D&D monster at your table, if you're playing a D&D, now you know where to find it, and if you're playing 5th edition, in the description down below, there is a 5th edition conversion of this monster that I have made in the form of a Google document, which contains everything you need to run it at the table. If you happen to be one of my lovely patrons, you will also find the 5th edition monster manual style stat block with the artwork and the extra lore tidbits and all that good stuff over on the Patreon page. So if you really want to throw that extra level of support my way, you can find the link to my Patreon down below also. Lastly, I'd like to thank the Seeds of Decay Kickstarter for financially supporting the channel and bringing us here to talk about the booze mummy this week. So here's the thing about them. A crack has formed in the darkness of the always green forest, leaking rot and decay. Trees are withering and crops are failing to mature. Strange, twisted creatures have been seen in the shadows. The Rot Weaver has returned. Will you save the forest from the spreading decay before it's too late? Seeds of Decay is a brand new adventure for 5th edition that brings you into the dark and whimsical world of daubers. Enjoy fully illustrated quests with unique maps, NPCs, monsters, and much more. Along with this grand adventure comes over 60 unique and scalable monsters that will tangle up every encounter, as well as new magic items, spells, races, classes, and subclasses. And if that wasn't enough, a brand new system for building contraptions and tools. You can check out the Kickstarter at seedsofdecay.com or by using the link in the description below. Thank you guys all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I will catch y'all in the next one. Until then.